My name is Henry Martyn Leland. They say I was the master of precision, the man who brought toolroom standards to the motorcar, and the founder of both Cadillac and Lincoln. Two names that would come to define American automotive excellence. I didn't invent the automobile, but I did insist it be built properly, to last, and to honor the dignity of every part within it. Tonight, I will tell you the story of my life. Did you know I started as a simple toolmaker? That I learned to file steel blocks so precisely they could swap places and still fit without flaw? That I brought this mindset to engines, to companies, and even to war work, long before people believed machines could be both beautiful and exact? If you were me, raised in the shadows of mills, taught to measure twice and cut once, tasked with leading companies through revolutions of steel and fire, would you have done better or differently? Would you have stood your ground when profit tried to outrun principle? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you could send a message to me in the past, perhaps to the boy filing brass in a dusty Vermont workshop, what would you write? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now listen to this interesting story about my life journey. I was born on February 16th, 1843, in Barton, Vermont, a place of forests and fields where the winters bit hard and the work never stopped. My family, like most in our town, lived simply. We valued honesty, hard work, and precision, not as lofty ideals, but as daily tools. You measured your days the way you measured lumber, carefully, truthfully, and with attention to the grain. I was the youngest of 8 children. There wasn't much to spare, not in money or in softness, but there was plenty of character. My father, Henry Leland, was a woodworker, not a man of words, but one who let his hands do the speaking. He could carve a spindle, build a barn door, or mend a wheel with such care that even as a child, I sensed it meant something more than usefulness. It meant pride. My mother, Zilpha, was equally strong. Her hands were never still, baking, sewing, tending to us children with a look that said, "Don't waste what you've been given." I listened. The town itself taught lessons too. In those days, boys learned early to take part in labor. By 10, I was splitting kindling and turning wood in my father's shed. But what fascinated me most wasn't the wood. It was the tools. The sharp chisel, the square that never lied, the file that turned rough into smooth. I loved their honesty. A tool, if used right, never betrayed you. When I was a little older, we moved briefly to Worcester, Massachusetts. There, I took odd jobs, sometimes as a delivery boy, sometimes assisting in the local factories. The machines captivated me. I didn't yet know what tolerances were or why bearings mattered, but I could feel, even then, the power of something made precisely. There's a strange kind of magic in turning a handle and watching 10 gears respond as if they share a single thought. At 15, I returned to Vermont and began a proper apprenticeship with a local machinist. Now, in those days, apprenticeships weren't just about clocking hours. They were about humility. You learned to sweep before you filed, to polish before you turned. And always, always, you were expected to watch. Not just with your eyes, but with your patience. The man who trained me was stern but fair. He once gave me a block of steel and told me to file it square on every side, until each face measured true to the 1,000th of an inch. I thought it would take an afternoon. It took 3 days. I remember my hands aching, my eyes blurry, the cold of the shop creeping up through my boots. But I also remember the click of his gauge when it finally passed inspection. "Now," he said, "you're ready to learn something." That's how it was back then. You didn't move on until you earned it. No shortcuts, no mercy, just craft. And if you were lucky, someone who noticed your care. Later, I moved again, this time to Springfield, Massachusetts, where I joined Brown & Sharp, a precision tool-making company. It was there I began to understand not just how to use machines, but how to make them better. At Brown & Sharp, everything was measured. Tools weren't just assembled, they were born from mathematics, from precision ground parts, from a language of micrometers and calipers. I soaked it in. My world grew sharper, cleaner, more exacting. That's where I first encountered what would become a lifelong obsession: interchangeable parts. The idea that two pieces, made by different men, at different times, in different places, could fit together without modification. It was revolutionary, and it planted in me a belief I would never shake: that consistency is a form of honor. Some people seek adventure, others fame. Me? I sought exactness. I believed that if a machine could be trusted to function flawlessly, then the man behind it had done something truly noble. Now let me ask you, if you were that boy in the cold Vermont shop, filing steel until your hands bled, would you keep going? Would you chase a future you could only feel in the metal, in the soft click of a gear turning just right? Or would you walk away, thinking there must be an easier path? Leave me a comment. I wonder how many of you would have stayed at that bench with me. As for me, I stayed. I learned, I endured, and in that quiet forge of steel, wool, and sweat, I became something more than just a machinist. I became a believer in perfection. After honing my skills in Vermont and Massachusetts, I found myself drawn toward the heart of industrial innovation: Hartford, Connecticut. It was 1865, and the Civil War had just ended. Factories that once produced weapons of war were beginning to pivot, recalibrating toward peacetime industry. But the need for precision hadn't faded. It had only sharpened. And it was there, in Hartford, that I joined the legendary Colt firearms manufacturing company. Now, if you've ever held a Colt revolver from that era, you know it wasn't just a weapon, it was a marvel. Samuel Colt had passed away just a few years earlier, but his legacy still lingered in the air like the scent of oil and gunmetal. His belief in interchangeable parts, in mechanical consistency, in the dignity of mass production done right. It resonated through every workstation, every blueprint, every inspector's nod of approval. I knew immediately I was in the right place. At Colt, they didn't just build guns, they built systems. The assembly lines were refined, disciplined. Each worker had a role, and each part had to match its counterpart within a tolerance so fine it bordered on obsessive. And I loved it. I studied not just the machines, but the men. How the foreman caught a flaw with a glance. How the toolmakers adjusted their jigs without a single wasted motion. I kept a notebook in my coat pocket and filled it every day with observations. How this jig improved output by 6%. How that template saved half an hour per unit. I came to understand that craftsmanship wasn't just about excellence. It was about repeatability. Anyone can make one beautiful thing, but can you make 1,000 of them, each as perfect as the last? That was the true test. And Colt had found a way to make that test passable. I worked first as a machinist, then as an inspector. I learned the importance of gauging standards, of treating tools as sacred extensions of your hand. We were building weapons, yes, but we were also building trust. Because when a soldier drew his revolver in a moment of desperation, that click had to come without hesitation. There could be no room for luck. During those years, I absorbed everything. My life was simple. Work, learn, rest, repeat. I rented a tiny room not far from the factory and spent most evenings rereading engineering manuals or sketching improved mechanisms by candlelight. I wasn't chasing wealth. I was chasing harmony between motion and intention. I remember one particular evening in late autumn, 1868. A shipment of cylinders had come in slightly warped, not by much, barely enough to be seen. But when I tested them in a finished frame, the balance was off, just a shade. I flagged the lot and sent them back, knowing full well it would delay the entire run. The manager was furious at first. "They'll work well enough," he growled. I shook my head. "They'll work until they don't, and that's not the same thing." He didn't thank me. But the next morning I noticed new inspection protocols added to the line. It was then I began to understand something crucial. If you want to lead with precision, you must be willing to endure discomfort. Speak up when it's unpopular. Stand firm when others waver. And perhaps most importantly, trust yourself. Now let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where speaking the truth would cost you convenience? Where holding your ground meant holding off progress, at least for a moment? Did you bite your tongue? Or did you, like I did, trust the standards you live by? If you could go back to that moment, would you make the same choice? Let me know in the comments. I wonder how many of you would have stopped the line with me. As for me, I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I knew that tolerating almost right was the first step toward wrong. By 1870, I had become one of Colt's most respected toolmakers. But more importantly, I had become a thinker of systems, a student of repeatable quality. And deep down, I began to feel the stirrings of a greater ambition. I didn't just want to improve machines. I wanted to improve the way they were born. In 1870, the rhythm of my life began to change, not in the shop, but in the heart. I married Ellen, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering calm. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was with purpose. She had the kind of eyes that could see through excuses and the kind of hands that knew how to comfort without words. We met in Connecticut at a church gathering one Sunday, and before long, I knew I'd found the one person who could steady me in ways machines never could. Marriage brought a new sense of responsibility. Suddenly, it wasn't just about my craft, it was about our future, a future that I sensed could not remain in Hartford. So, after a few more years in New England, Ellen and I packed our belongings and headed west to Detroit. At the time, Detroit wasn't yet the industrial powerhouse it would become. But it was growing, pulsing with ambition and promise. There was space there, not just physical, but creative. I saw workshops opening along dusty streets, new businesses rising like timber frames waiting to be sealed. It was a city on the verge of something great. I found work quickly, first in local machine shops, then as a toolmaker again, and eventually as a supervisor in a small precision engineering firm. In each role, I carried the Colt standards with me: exactness, order, and repeatability. But here I had more freedom to experiment. The shops were less rigid, less tradition-bound. If you could prove it worked, they let you do it. And I proved it. One of the first machines I helped redesign was a gear-cutting lathe. The original model vibrated under load, which caused subtle but disastrous inconsistencies in the teeth. I reweighted the base, adjusted the feed rate, and replaced the worn spindle with a more balanced alloy. When the new gears were tested, they meshed silently. That silence, to me, was the sweetest music. Around this time, Ellen and I welcomed our son, Wilfred, a quiet child like his mother, with wide eyes and careful fingers. I remember watching him build little wooden carts in the backyard, mimicking my work with scraps of pine and bent nails. I didn't push him toward engineering, but he gravitated to it all the same. Maybe he saw how much I loved it, or maybe the rhythm of precision simply runs in the blood. In 1880, I took a leap. With a few partners, I co-founded a small tool company. We specialized in gear cutters, fixtures, and other metalworking tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. And more than that, it was mine. I could shape it with care. I could set the standards. We didn't grow fast. I was deliberate. I didn't want shortcuts or flash. I wanted to build a name people could trust. Each tool that left our shop bore not only my inspection, but my pride. One evening I stayed late testing a batch of micrometers. The tolerances were off by less than a hair's width, but I caught it. The foreman, a good man, said, "They're still within spec, Henry." I looked at him and said, "Maybe for today. But will they still be right 1,000 measurements from now?" He didn't argue. We scrapped the batch and started over. That's how reputations are built. Not in grand gestures, but in small decisions made when no one's watching. Now let me ask you, if you had a chance to shape something your own way, but it meant slower progress, tighter margins, more effort, would you take it? Would you insist on your standards, even when easier roads lay ahead? Or would you compromise to keep the lights on? Let me know below. I wonder what kind of shop you'd run. As for me, I chose the harder path. Always. Not because I was noble, but because I knew where the other road led. I'd seen too many businesses fail because they let good enough creep in. By the late 1880s, my name was becoming known in Detroit's engineering circles. Not loud, not famous, but respected. If something needed to be measured, fixed, or built with precision, they came to us. And slowly, my little tool shop grew. Wilfred was growing too. By his teenage years, he was already learning to use a lathe, sketching designs and helping with basic inspections. I never said it aloud, but I was proud. Not just because he was skilled, but because he was patient. He understood that machines weren't tamed with brute force, but with care. Detroit, by then, was buzzing with talk of something new, horseless carriages. Most people thought they were toys. I wasn't so sure. I saw the same promise I had once seen in interchangeable parts. A new frontier, a new challenge. I didn't know yet how deeply I would step into that world, but the seeds were there. For now, I stayed with my gears, with my gauges, with my little workshop that hummed late into the night. Because I believed, with every cell of my being, that even the smallest part mattered. By 1890, I was nearing 50. Some men might have slowed down at that age, satisfied with what they'd built. But not me. If anything, I was just getting started. That year, I took a bold step, perhaps the boldest of my career. I co-founded the Leland and Faulconer manufacturing company with my partner Charles Faulconer. It wasn't an overnight decision. Charles and I had worked together before, and while we were different in temperament, he being more relaxed, I more exacting. We shared a respect for precision. He understood numbers, finances, relationships. I understood machines. Together, we could be formidable. So we opened our doors in Detroit, focused on manufacturing precision gears, fixtures, and internal combustion engine components. Nothing glamorous, but everything vital. We were surrounded by an industry in flux. Gasoline engines were beginning to stir curiosity, even if they were still viewed by many as unreliable or dangerous. But I saw something else. I saw an opportunity to shape the future, not just of machines, but of the very standards by which they were judged. I laid down two unbreakable rules at Leland and Faulconer. First, every product must be inspected. Every bolt, every gear, every casing, checked and checked again. Second, if you wouldn't trust the part in your own hands, it doesn't leave the shop. I didn't care about volume. I cared about perfection. Even if it meant delivering fewer orders or spending long nights correcting what others would let pass. That obsession came to define us. I remember a young machinist once trying to slip through a batch of camshafts without full gauging. I called him over, handed him a magnifying glass, and told him to find his mistake. It took him 20 minutes, but he found it. A flaw so small it wouldn't have shown up for months, until the engine seized in some farmer's field or at the base of a hill. That moment stayed with him. Years later, he thanked me, saying, "You taught me to build for the long run, not the quick buck." I liked that. By the mid-1890s, we had earned a reputation. Our gears ran quieter. Our parts lasted longer. Engineers across Detroit knew that if they needed a job done right, they came to us. We built engines for marine applications, refrigeration units, and early stationary engines. All of it prepared me for what was coming next, even if I didn't know it yet. Then came 1899. The Detroit Automobile Company, one of the city's first serious attempts at building cars, approached us. They wanted engines, high-quality ones, the kind that wouldn't rattle apart on Michigan's rough roads. We delivered, and they were pleased. But the company? It was a mess. Disorganized, rushed, focused more on showing investors something shiny than on building something that worked. Still, in the background of that company stood a man who caught my eye. Young, restless, full of ideas. His name was Henry Ford. We didn't work closely at the time, but I noticed him. Quiet, observant. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. We would cross paths again. Around that time, I also began to take Wilfred deeper into the business. He was growing into a thoughtful, methodical young man, curious, steady, and thankfully, patient with my demands. I had him start on the floor like everyone else. No titles, no special treatment, just steel, sweat, and precision. He understood. One evening, he asked me why I always made him start from scratch, why I didn't just train him in management from the top down. I said, "Because a man who doesn't understand how a gear turns has no right to tell someone how to make one." That became another of our unspoken rules. Lead from knowledge, not position. Let me ask you, if you were building something meant to last, would you cut corners to get ahead? Or would you double back, slow down, and do it the hard way? The right way? Would you trade speed for substance? Leave me a comment. I wonder how many of you would take the long road with me. By 1900, Leland and Faulconer had become a cornerstone of Detroit's growing mechanical world. We weren't the biggest, but we were the most trusted. I could walk through the factory and see men proud of their tools, apprentices checking dimensions with care. We had built something rare, a company driven not by profit alone, but by principle. And then came a letter. A group of investors wanted to start a new automobile company, one that would outlast the failures of others, one built not on spectacle, but on sound engineering. They wanted me to build their engine, and the company they were forming had a name I would never forget: Cadillac. When they first came to me about Cadillac, I was cautious. The motorcar world was still filled with dreamers, tinkerers, and far too many men chasing attention instead of excellence. But when I read their proposal, and especially when I heard the name, Cadillac, I paused. Antoine Lomé de la Mothe, Sieur de Cadillac, a founder's name, a name tied to this very city. There was something honorable in that, historic, intentional. So I said yes. In 1902, I agreed to supply engines for this new company. Initially, just that. I would not oversee design or sales, just the motor itself. But very quickly, things began to shift. The original founders parted ways. There was disagreement, disarray. And soon enough, the investors looked to me, not just for engines, but for leadership. They needed someone who could bring order to the chaos. I didn't step forward out of ambition. I stepped forward because I could not stand disorder. I believed a car, like a company, should run smoothly, without rattle or protest. And so, at nearly 60 years of age, I took the reins of Cadillac Motor Car Company. We began building automobiles in earnest, and from the start, I imposed a philosophy that had guided me all my life. Everything must be measured. Everything must be interchangeable. That word, interchangeable, wasn't new to me. I had learned it at Colt decades earlier. It meant that every part in every car had to be machined to such tight tolerances that it could be swapped with the same part in another car, and it would fit perfectly. No filing, no hammering, no guesswork. At the time, other car makers were still crafting vehicles like coach builders, hand-fitting every piece, adjusting with a file, tuning by ear. No two cars were exactly the same. But I wanted to make machines, not mysteries. We refined our processes. We invested in gauges, jigs, micrometers, hardened steel tooling. Every part was cataloged, inspected, compared. It was slow at first, tedious even. Some of the young men didn't see the point, but I insisted. I told them, "You're not just building a car, you're building trust." And then, in 1905, we proved it. That year, at the Royal Automobile Club in London, we staged what would come to be known as the standardization test. We sent 3 Cadillacs across the ocean. The officials disassembled each one completely, every nut, every gear, every piston, mixing all the parts into a single pile. Then they asked us to rebuild 3 complete cars from that random pile of parts. We did. Every bolt fit. Every part found its place. The engines roared to life without hesitation. The Royal Automobile Club awarded Cadillac the Dewar Trophy, a rare honor given for technical excellence in the motor industry. It was the first time an American company had received it. And it wasn't just a win for Cadillac. It was a win for the idea of precision manufacturing itself. That moment changed everything. Suddenly, people began to see that American cars could be not just cheaper, but better, reliable, repeatable. It was no longer necessary to ship a car back to the factory when it broke down. A mechanic could open a parts catalog, order a replacement, and trust that it would fit. That was my dream all along, to bring machine logic to the messy world of motion. Let me ask you something. If you were building something others believed could never be standardized, would you press on? Would you endure the skepticism, the slowness, the extra hours of measuring, just to prove that one thing done right is better than 100 done quickly? Or would you compromise just to be first? Tell me in the comments. I wonder if you would have had the patience I demanded, not just from others, but from myself. Back at the factory, the success of the doer test set a new tone. Our engineers walked taller. Our machinists began to take pride in the tiny numbers engraved into their micrometers. We were no longer just making cars. We were defining what it meant to make cars well. And yet, I never let us get comfortable. Even after the award, I walked the floor. I checked parts myself. I kept a little notebook in my pocket and filled it with sketches, tolerances, corrections. I once told a foreman, "I'll stop checking when the machines start checking themselves." He chuckled, but I wasn't joking. Cadillac began to grow quickly. Sales rose. We moved into larger facilities. New models were developed. But through it all, I held fast to the belief that interchangeability wasn't a marketing point. It was a moral one. A way of saying, we respect the people who buy these machines. We will not leave them stranded. Wilfred, by now, was managing whole teams. He was becoming more than just my son. He was my second mind. I trusted him with decisions. I let him challenge me, occasionally even correct me. It was a quiet pride watching him take what I had taught and refine it in his own way. By 1905, Cadillac was no longer just a newcomer. It was a benchmark. Other companies began to follow our lead, investing in better tooling, tighter inspections, more thoughtful engineering. And for me, that was more rewarding than any trophy, because it meant that the standard had risen, not just for Cadillac, but for all of us. By 1905, Cadillac was no longer a bold experiment. It was a thriving reality. We had won the Doer Trophy, yes, but more than that, we had earned trust. Customers wrote to us not just about the beauty of our machines, but their reliability. Mechanics praised the simplicity of service. Dealers valued consistency in every delivery. That was the real prize for me. Not applause, but confirmation that our standards had taken root. But success, as I've often learned, doesn't simplify things. It complicates them. The automotive world was growing fast. Too fast, perhaps. New companies sprang up monthly, often backed by bankers chasing the promise of the motor car as the next gold rush. Some built decent machines. Most did not. But all were loud, all were moving. I began to feel the tremors of a business I had long considered a craft shifting into something far more volatile. And then came General Motors. At the time, GM was a relatively young holding company, formed by a man named William C. Durant. Durant was everything I was not. Theatrical, daring, ambitious in a way that made the stock market his racetrack. He believed in growth by acquisition, buy the best, stack them together, and dominate the industry. He had already gathered Buick and Oldsmobile under his umbrella, and now his eyes were on Cadillac. I resisted at first. Not because of price, because of principle. To me, Cadillac was more than a business. It was a statement. A belief in precision, quality, and moral responsibility. I didn't want it turned into a trophy or absorbed into a structure where our careful pace would be traded for fast profits. But Durant was persistent and persuasive. He promised independence, He promised that Cadillac would remain its own operation, free to maintain its methods and leadership. He promised that our name would be protected, not diluted. And after long discussion, with Wilfred, with the board, with myself, I agreed. In 1909, we sold Cadillac to General Motors for the sum of $4.5 million, a fortune at the time. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't take a holiday. I didn't even leave the factory, because for me, the work wasn't done. We were still producing engines, still refining gearboxes, still holding our tolerances to the thousandth of an inch. Durant kept his promise at first. He allowed us to run our own division, to uphold our standards, and to push ahead with innovation. But I could feel the atmosphere shift. Slowly, subtly, the conversations changed, from questions about the metal's grain structure to projections about quarterly returns, from the squeak of a bearing to the squeal of Wall Street. One memory stands out. I was reviewing a run of cylinder heads and noticed a minor imperfection, a casting bubble no larger than a fingernail. I ordered the entire batch scrapped and reworked. One of the new financial men came to me afterward and said, "That flaw wouldn't have affected performance. Why waste the money?" I looked at him and replied, "Perhaps not, but it would have affected trust." That, I think, is where our visions began to diverge. Let me ask you, if you had spent your life building something based on integrity, and you saw its soul beginning to shift, would you walk away? Or would you stay, hoping you could still steer it back toward the truth? I stayed, for a time, but eventually it became clear that Cadillac's destiny was now tied to a machine I no longer fully trusted. GM was growing into a behemoth, and with that came bureaucracy, pressure, and the slow erosion of what I had once held sacred. Wilfred and I had many talks in those years. He was a bridge between generations. He understood my old-world craftsmanship, but could also see the necessity of scale and adaptation. He tried to balance both, and for a while he succeeded. But I could feel the pull of a different calling. You see, there was something stirring in the air, something beyond automobiles. Flight. Airplanes had once seemed like novelties to me. Fragile things, more spectacle than substance. But as I watched pioneers like the Wright brothers defy gravity, I began to wonder, what if the same principles of precision and reliability we'd brought to cars could be applied to the skies? I started studying aero engines in my spare time, sketching ideas, reading reports from France and Britain. It was still early days, and the engines powering those flimsy biplanes were often crude and inconsistent. But I knew we could do better. I began to talk of new ventures, of a fresh start. Not because I hated Cadillac, but because I loved what Cadillac had once stood for, and I wanted to build something that could stand for that again. Something where the decisions would be made not by financiers, but by engineers. Where perfection wouldn't be questioned. It would be the baseline. I didn't know what it would be yet, but I knew it was coming. And so in 1910, I began to step back. Not entirely, but quietly. I let the younger men take the stage. I stopped attending some of the board meetings. I returned to my first love, the machine itself. Let me ask you, have you ever built something only to watch it change? Not collapse, not fail, just become something else. What did you do? Did you fight to preserve it? Did you mourn it? Or did you take what you learned and begin again? Tell me in the comments. I wonder how many of you would choose the harder road, the lonelier one, the road of the builder, not the brand. As for me, I chose to start again, because sometimes the only way to keep a promise is to build it twice. Leaving Cadillac wasn't a single decision made one morning over coffee. It was a slow drift, a realization that came not in anger, but in quiet disappointment. By 1909, the ink on the sale contract had long dried, and I had done what many considered unthinkable. I had let go of the company I helped build from bolts and blueprints into a national standard of excellence. And yet, I stayed on for a time after the sale, still walking the factory floor, still listening to the whine of gears and the click of micrometers. My title remained, but the company's soul was shifting. General Motors, under Durant's hand, was a machine of its own, ambitious, relentless, and driven by numbers more than nuts and bolts. I don't blame Durant entirely. He was a man of vision in his own right, but he saw vision in expansion, not in refinement. And I believed in refinement above all. It wasn't just about making a car move. It was about making it move right. I remember one afternoon in 1911. We had just reviewed a batch of steering mechanisms, and I noticed a deviation, subtle, barely visible to the naked eye, but enough to alter the feel of the drive. I ordered a halt, a full inspection, and replacement. The response I received from the executive office was polite but clear. "Mr. Leland, perhaps this level of precision isn't required on this scale." That word, required, struck me. Since when did we build only to meet requirements? What about pride? What about the silent pact between maker and driver that says, "I built this to the very best of my ability"? That moment stayed with me. It was the splinter beneath the skin that festered slowly. And it wasn't alone. More and more, I saw decisions made to appease markets, not mechanics. Budgets tightening, materials compromised. I was told now and then that I was too careful, that I didn't understand the speed of business. But I did understand it. I simply believed it should never outrun integrity. Wilfred, my son and closest confidant, often urged caution. He respected my ideals but also saw the forest through the trees. "We can't save the whole world with tolerances, Father," he said once gently. But I wasn't trying to save the world. I was trying to protect a principle. I began withdrawing from Cadillac's operations more deliberately by 1912. I spent more time in my own private workshop, tinkering with alternative designs, quietly keeping notes. And then, as the world turned its gaze toward the winds of war in Europe, a new question began to form. If machines were about to reshape battle, could we not apply our precision to ensure they were more reliable, more humane even, in their certainty? It sounds odd, doesn't it? The idea of bringing ethics into machinery. But I've always believed that how a thing is built reflects why it is built. And if war was coming, the world would need machines that didn't fail. Then came the tipping point. In 1914, war erupted in Europe. The Great War, they called it, though none of us yet knew just how great the cost would be. I watched the headlines, read the reports, and saw one truth clearly. This was not a time for compromise. It was a time for standards. And Cadillac, my Cadillac, was drifting toward the very compromises I could no longer abide. By 1915, I had made my decision. I would resign, fully, formally, and with no fanfare. I remember that day clearly. Early spring, the smell of oil and steel in the air. I walked the floor one last time, nodding to machinists, examining a crankcase, listening to the chatter of the shop. Some of the men didn't even realize it was my last round. I didn't announce it. I simply handed in my papers and shook Wilfred's hand. He knew. He didn't stop me. Let me ask you, if you saw your dream becoming a stranger, if the very thing you'd once loved no longer reflected your soul, would you hold on? Or let go? Would you trust that another dream might still be waiting? Would you, like me, believe that sometimes the best way to honor your past is to begin again? Leave me a comment below. I wonder how many of you have walked away from something, not in anger, but in principle. Because that's what this was. It wasn't a retreat. It was a stand. One that would shape what came next. Wilfred and I began to talk again. This time, not about sustaining the old, but about creating the new. And what we saw on the horizon was something far bigger than cars, something more urgent. Engines, aircraft. Liberty Motors was still a faint idea then, a flicker, but it was enough. Enough to keep my hands busy, my mind engaged, and my heart steady. Because a man must live by his code. And mine was simple. Build it right, or build something else. They say necessity is the mother of invention. I've always thought it was something quieter. Conviction, perhaps. A whisper that says, even now, there is something worth doing. That whisper is what carried Wilfred and me through the dark years of the First World War. And in 1917, as the world thundered with conflict and sorrow, we answered that call not by retreating, but by founding something new, the Lincoln Motor Company. Yes, Lincoln. Named not for glory, but for integrity. Abraham Lincoln was a man I revered deeply, not for his power, but for his principles. I wanted our engines to bear the name of a man who stood unshakably for what was right. I hoped that would remind us, even on the hardest days, of what mattered most. The idea was straightforward. Build aircraft engines for the US government to support the war effort. But the path? That was anything but smooth. We didn't start with grand buildings or deep reserves. We started with an old electric plant in Detroit, dark and echoing, waiting to be filled with machines and purpose. And quickly, we had both. The government contracted us to build the Liberty V-12, a powerful new aircraft engine designed in a rush to catch up with Europe's advancements. We had to produce thousands, and fast. Now, I've never been one to rush. Rushing leads to imprecision, but I also understood the stakes. So I brought every lesson from Cadillac into that cavernous space, the tolerances, the interchangeability, the demand for perfection. The Liberty engine had to work, every time. Men's lives would depend on it at 10,000 feet. There could be no excuses. We hired fast, trained faster. I walked the lines every morning, even when my legs ached. Wilfred, as always, kept the operation humming with his gift for logistics. It was as if all our years of quiet preparation had readied us for this singular moment. By 1918, we were producing hundreds of engines a week. Some went into training aircraft, some into bombers. Some never left storage before the war ended. But all of them bore our name and our care. Then came the armistice. The war was over. The orders stopped almost overnight. But we were still standing, infrastructure in place, talent assembled, machinery waiting. What now? Most would have closed up, pocketed what they could, and moved on. But I saw another road. I had never stopped thinking about automobiles, about that perfect balance between reliability and grace. I missed the hum of an engine tuned for silence, the elegant tension of a well-machined crankshaft. And so we pivoted. Lincoln became a car company. Our first model, released in 1920, wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. It was tall, strong, dignified, a quiet luxury machine for a more thoughtful age. It didn't race or roar. It glided. It didn't pander. It promised. We poured the same wartime precision into every inch. Cast aluminum engine blocks, balanced drive shafts, finely tuned steering. But the market, it wasn't ready. The post-war economy was strange, booming in places, collapsing in others. And our car, though fine, was expensive. Too expensive. We built for pride, not for volume. And it nearly broke us. By 1922, Lincoln Motor Company was in financial trouble. Orders dwindled, debts mounted. The very dream I had built to honor peace and precision was once again teetering. I remember the meetings, Wilfred trying to hold the books together, me resisting every suggestion to cut corners. Eventually, we had no choice. We had to sell. And who came to our door? Henry Ford. The irony, of course, was not lost on me. Ford, the man of mass production, the man who had made the automobile commonplace while I had tried to make it exceptional. We had never seen eye to eye, not in principle, not in purpose. But Ford saw value in Lincoln, or at least Edsel did, his son. And it was Edsel who convinced his father to buy us out. The sale was made in 1922. We handed over control. I stayed on briefly as a consultant, Wilfred too. But it was clear, our time at Lincoln, our attempt to shape a legacy of quiet excellence was done. It stung. I won't lie, but I don't regret it. We built something good, honest, strong. And we built it in the middle of a world falling apart. Now let me ask you, if you had one last great effort in you, if the world came knocking, asking for your craft in a time of crisis, would you rise knowing it might not last? Knowing it might not make you rich? Only that it mattered. Would you answer with the same care you gave to your best work? Leave a comment below. I wonder if you too would name your work after a man of principle and give it everything you had. Because I did. And even though it didn't end the way I dreamed, I still believe it was right. That matters more. When we sold Lincoln to Henry Ford in 1922, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. And one I don't wish upon any builder who cares too deeply for the things they make. At first, I convinced myself it would work. Edsel Ford had a gentleness about him, a quiet ambition that reminded me a little of myself in younger years. He respected what Wilfred and I had built. He admired Lincoln's craftsmanship, its upright dignity. And I believed, truly, that if anyone could preserve the soul of our machines under a new roof, it would be him. So I stayed. Not as an owner, of course, but as a consultant. I walked the floor, offered advice, inspected new prototypes with my same old measuring gaze. Wilfred remained involved too, managing engineering direction. We still wore our suits every morning. We still carried notebooks in our pockets. But slowly, imperceptibly, things began to shift. Ford was a machine in more ways than one. Not just the company, but the man himself. Henry Ford believed in simplicity, of purpose, of design, of cost. He believed the automobile was for the masses, not the few. And while I respected his accomplishments, I could never see eye to eye with him on what a motor car ought to be. For me, the car was more than transport. It was a symbol of precision, of trust. It carried your family, your name, your very dignity on the road. Henry Ford, I think, saw it as a box with wheels. There were disagreements, naturally. I objected to shortcuts. I questioned materials. I fought for margins tighter than his accountants liked. But each time I was met with smiles, nods, and eventually, silence. Fewer of my suggestions were implemented. Fewer of Wilfred's requests were funded. The breaking point came in 1927. Not with shouting, not with slammed doors, but with a quiet, administrative decision. Edsel, who had once been the gentle bridge between our vision and his father's empire, was replaced as the day-to-day overseer of Lincoln's engineering direction. From that point forward, Henry himself, or rather, his tight-lipped circle, took firmer control. I wasn't consulted. Wilfred wasn't either. Designs we had sketched together were shelved. Production methods were altered. The balance between craftsmanship and efficiency tipped hard toward the latter. And worst of all, they made it clear, in the kindest language a corporate memo can deliver, that our involvement was no longer required. Betrayal is too strong a word for most things. But this came close. I remember the morning I left the Lincoln plant for the last time. A rainy Thursday. The smell of fresh-cut aluminum still in the air. I paused near the assembly line and watched a chassis glide past, streamlined, simplified, standardized, efficient, but not mine, not anymore. Wilfred walked beside me, silent as ever. I think he carried more pain than I did. He had grown that company like a gardener tending roots, and now it was someone else's garden. Someone who trimmed for speed, not shape. We didn't speak much on the ride home, just watched the city blur past the windows. Let me ask you something now, as you sit with this story in your ears. If the thing you loved most, the company you birthed, the principles you lived by, was taken from your hands and reshaped into something you no longer recognized, would you fight? Or would you step back? Would you trust that you had already planted something deeper than metal? Leave me a comment. I wonder if your heart would have done better than mine. Because I didn't fight. I stepped back. I was 74 years old, tired, weathered. My bones ached in ways they hadn't before, and the engine in my chest, though steady, had begun to lose compression. But even in stepping away, I refused to sour. I told myself that our work lived on, in the principles we had taught, in the young engineers who now carried micrometers with pride, in the silent hum of a Lincoln rolling down the street with no rattle, no clang. They might not know it came from us, but the smoothness, the reliability, that was ours. Still, the bitterness lingered, because I had believed, perhaps too innocently, that legacy was immune to industry. It isn't. Legacy must be protected by vigilance, by clarity, by walking away, sometimes, before the compromise gets written into the blueprint. That's what I learned. That's what I pass to you. So if your day comes, if the factory floor you love no longer feels like home, ask yourself, is it better to stay and be forgotten in the noise? Or to leave quietly, knowing the silence will remember you? As for me, I left, and I waited to see what, if anything, would carry forward. By the time the world stepped into the final years of the 1920s, I had stepped back from the engine's roar. Not entirely, of course. My hands still found their way to blueprints. My ears still caught the subtle tremble of misaligned parts. But I was no longer at the center of the workshop. My time had passed, and in truth, I welcomed the quiet. I spent those final years in Detroit and in the peaceful stretches of Vermont, where the roads curled like ribbon through pine-scented hills. My health was failing. My legs weakened, and my lungs, once strong from years walking factory floors, struggled with each season's change. But my mind? It hummed on, like a well-tuned Liberty engine, slow but steady. And it was in that slowing down that I began to truly reflect. I thought often of those early days in the tool room, how a boy with sharp eyes and a will to learn became a man trusted to guide machines into war and peace alike. I thought of Cadillac and the precision we made sacred, of Lincoln and its short but dignified path. I thought of Wilfred, his quiet steadiness, his unshakable belief in doing things the right way, no matter the cost. And I thought of the men and women who had passed through our factories, hands calloused by craft, hearts shaped by effort. They were never just workers to me. They were the soul of what we built. Because here's something I came to understand. You don't measure a man's work by the buildings he owns or the patents in his name. You measure it by how faithfully he served his principles, by how often he chose the hard right over the easy wrong, and by how clearly those around him could see what he stood for without needing to ask. That's what I hoped to leave behind. Not just parts and processes, but a blueprint for ethical engineering, for craftsmanship rooted not in profit, but in care. In those last years, I met with young engineers now and then. They would come with sketches and questions, notebooks bursting with ideas. Some were bright with talent, others bright with ambition. I welcomed both, but I always gave them the same advice. Whatever you build, make it good enough to carry someone you love. That was my measure. If it wouldn't carry Wilfred across a snowy Vermont pass, or hold together with my grandchildren inside on a fog-slicked Detroit road, it wasn't ready. It didn't matter how clever the design was, or how cheap it could be made. If it didn't last, it didn't count. I passed away quietly in March of 1932, at the age of 89. No grand farewell, no orchestral swell, just the last exhale of a life well used, I think. My bones tired, my tools laid down. But my work, that kept going. You see, even after I was gone, my principles whispered through the gears of every careful engine, through the quiet tick of a properly set micrometer, through the hand-polished edge of a car door fitted just so. I'd like to believe they still whisper today. Now I ask you, dear listener, if your life's work were to outlive you, how would you want it to be remembered? Not just your name, but the feeling people get when they use what you've built. Would they feel trust? Would they feel care? Or would they feel nothing at all? Leave me a comment. I wonder what values your fingerprints would carry. As for me, I am content, because I did what I could, and I did it with all the precision my trembling hands could offer. So now we've reached the end, not just of the story, but of a life lived with tools in hand and purpose in heart. You've walked with me from a Vermont farm to the factory floors of Detroit, through machine shops, boardrooms, and battlefields. You've seen the triumphs and the trials, the steady rise, the costly stands, the quiet exits. But more than that, I hope you've felt what I felt. That work, when done with sincerity, becomes more than labor. It becomes legacy. I never had sons or daughters of my own, but in every apprentice I mentored, in every young machinist I stopped to guide, I saw something just as sacred. a lineage of minds and hands devoted to doing things the right way. And if you're listening now, that lineage includes you. Maybe you're not an engineer. Maybe your tools are words or numbers or music or kindness. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you hold yourself to a standard, that you build not just for money or recognition, but because you care, because the world needs more builders like that. Today, Rolls-Royce still stands. The name Lincoln still carries grace. Even General Motors, that old competitor, still makes machines that hum with life. And in the hum of every well-built engine, I hear the echo of every lesson I lived by. Balance, precision, respect for the craft, and above all, honesty. Honesty in work, honesty in design, honesty in knowing when something is not yet good enough, and in having the courage to make it better. If you remember anything from my story, let it be this. Do not rush the job. Do not cheat the process. Whether you're building a bridge or baking bread, take the time to do it with care. Leave no loose bolt, no unmeasured mark. Let your work speak for you when you are no longer here to explain it, because you will leave something behind. We all do, and I hope for your sake and the world's, that what you leave will whisper not of perfection, but of intent, of purpose, of love for the thing itself. That is enough. That is everything. Good night, dear listener. Rest well, and may whatever you build tomorrow carry the weight of your best self. Sweet dreams.